Boardroom, Chapter 34, Part B, 1491 BC, Moses. Pharaoh himself rode out with the cavalry and watched as 1,000,000 people quickly packed their tents and belongings. He even ordered his soldiers to assist them. By 10 a.m., the caravan was headed north along the west bank of the Red Sea. The sea was 20 miles wide at this point of their tent city, but gradually narrowed to the north. Some 10 miles north there was a narrows where a floating bridge spanned the sea. It was called the Gateway Bridge of Ramses. GATR was the term used by the locals. Moses figured at 2 miles an hour the massive caravan would reach the bridge by nightfall, camp there, and then cross in the morning. If Pharaoh's mind showed any sign of changing, and it hadn't so far, Moses would then push his caravan across the river by night. So far, Moses had not seen any change in Pharaoh's mind, and if there had been, Moses would know it immediately. The two had become fast friends growing up together, and each knew the other like a book. Moses went over and had one more chat with his friend as the packing was proceeding. He expressed his condolences for Pharaoh's loss. Pharaoh told him to pack quickly and get out. He never wanted to see another Hebrew as long as he lived. The caravan was late getting going, but by 3 p.m. it was within a mile of the bridge. Moses sent his most trusted associate Joshua on ahead by horse to alert the bridge guards to clear the way for the caravan. Moses decided to make the crossing at night, fearing still that his old buddy might change his mind. Even if he did, Moses and the caravan would be safely on the other side. They could burn the east end of the bridge, and it would take Pharaoh several days at best to repair it. By that time, Moses could have his caravan far out into the Sinai Desert. It was about 400 miles from Egypt to their new homeland of Canaan. Moses conservatively estimated that the caravan would make 10 miles a week at minimum. He was taking into account weekend rest, breakdown, attacks by desert raiders, and the like. That would put them on Canaan's doorstep in about 40 weeks. Moses did get the 40 right. "Did you let the bridge master know we are here?" Moses asked. "No," Joshua said, clearly out of breath. His horse was breathing even harder than its rider. "There's a cavalry company stationed at the bridge. There's no way we're going to get through them." Moses' face turned pale. He was a virile man, some 6 feet tall, and though with a receding hairline, he had a well-trimmed beard and deep-set black eyes that disarmed many. But he was now 80 years old. As he wavered backward, slightly trying to absorb the bad news, he caught a glint of light from the top of the ridge to the west. He could make out several cavalrymen, and he knew there were 1,000 more just beyond the crest. "An eye for an eye, old buddy." "What'd you say, boss?" Caleb, his trail boss, asked. "Looks like my old pal Pharaoh has recanted," Moses sighed. "Better send one of your riders to check back to the south." "Jeremiah?" Caleb pointed to the south. Within minutes he returned. 5,000 strong, and I think one of the battle flags is that of Pharaoh himself," Jeremiah dutifully reported as he saluted. "Looks like they got us, sir," Caleb said dejectedly. "I'll mobilize the militia. We'll fight 'em off and cross the bridge. God will help us, won't he?" Joshua protested. Moses stared up at the bridge. He could now see many more soldiers lining it. "I expected as much, but I thought we'd make the bridge before Pharaoh got things together. No such luck." "I'll get 'em ready to fight," Joshua said, turning his horse. Moses raised his hand. "Give me a couple of minutes. Let's talk to the boss." Moses headed away, and the three waited, each shaking his head in disbelief. Moses stepped into the entryway of the mobile temple. He could hear the priests chanting in the main sanctuary. The temple was being carried by 20 strong men. The priests alone carried the ark. The 12 priests rotated in shifts of 4. Moses was startled to see Pop standing inside the entryway. The two began to walk along at the same pace as the temple bearers. "Got us in a real mess now," Moses said impetuously. "How so?" Pop said in an even tone. "Just look outside. A child of 4 can see it." Moses said, throwing up his hands. He folded back the flap to show Pops what was going on. We're surrounded by Mr. Evil on 3 sides. By this time tomorrow we'll all be dead. A child of 4 is sometimes very perceptive, Pop said, still in an even tone of voice. We got there, old man. We're surrounded as in it's over. Moses' face was turning red. Sorry, he continued, realizing he had just yelled at the king of the universe. Pop's expression did not change. What's to the east? Pops asked. 600-foot deep sea. Moses answered the obvious question, irritation returning to his voice. Correction, 1,000 feet deep. Whatever, you got us boxed in. It was your intention to see us all slaughtered. Why didn't you just let Pharaoh do it in Egypt? Would have saved us a lot of work. Pops was dressed in typical Bedouin garb and now put his right hand on his exasperated friend's shoulder. A tear clung to Pop's left lower eyelid, then released and ran down his cheek to his pearl-white beard. Moses noticed this and began to relax a bit. What will you have me do, Father? The enemy's on the march. I haven't much time. Pops held out a gnarled walking stick he was using. Take this walking stick, over to the water's edge and hold it over the water for a full 11 minutes, and your foe will be vanquished. How will this little wooden stick accomplish anything? Furthermore, the enemy is the other direction. Shouldn't I hold it to the west? Moses realized the absurdity to expect this little stick to accomplish anything. I might correct you once more. Your only enemy is still your own self. Now would you please take the stick and do as I say? Pops gave Moses a little shove and extended his hand outward, beckoning him to get on with it. Okay, Moses said, holding up the little stick in a skeptical concession to his superior. You're the boss. Yes, I am. Moses walked toward the doorway, then turned back. By the way, thanks for saving my son last night. He then ran out before Pops could reply. Moses waved at Joshua, Caleb, and Jeremiah to follow and ran over to the water's edge. They walked onto a rock shelf overlooking the sea. They then looked back at the 3 armies converging on them. Some of the people at the back of the caravan, still heading north toward the bridge despite the advancing cavalry, noted that their leader on the rock and stopped to watch him. Well, here goes, Moses said. Here goes what? Joshua said. Pops told me to... never mind. Just pray harder than you've ever have in your life that this works. Now come on, little buddy, he said, talking to the little walking stick. Do your stuff. What stuff? Caleb said. There are armies marching toward us and you're... Quiet, Moses said, interrupting his skeptical friend. He held the stick lightly and it began to feel warm. He held it to the east out over the lapping waves which broke on the shore every 11 seconds or so. In a voice that could be heard by all in the vicinity, he called, Dear God in heaven, save us from our enemies this day. Ironically, today was April Fool's Day, and God was not even in heaven, but in a tent not 100 feet from him. He held the stick firmly as it began to warm. After about 5 waves broke, Joshua said, I'll go and muster the militia. Moses held up his other hand and spread his fingers. 10. Give me 10 minutes. 10 more minutes. Joshua got up on his horse, but continued the little vigil ordered by Moses. After approximately 9 more minutes, the crooked little stick began to glow. Faintly at first, but eventually it turned bright red and then blue. As the heat began to intensify, it began to activate the pain fibers in the right hand of Moses. The pain began to get unbearable, but Moses was determined not to let it go no matter what. Precisely as the 60th wave broke on the shore of the relatively calm Red Sea, since Moses had been holding the little stick, the water suddenly began to churn. The wind began to pick up velocity. It was directed straight at them from the east. Within a couple of minutes, a depression began forming on the water's surface. It began to extend eastward across the water. It continued to expand and soon was a mile wide. It continued east, exposing more and more of the seabed. Inexplicably, the edges of the depression were no higher than the rest of the sea. People in the caravan began to notice, and soon anywhere at the water's edge where a mile-wide strip of land was now exposed. Many were wondering if the path would accommodate the throng of 1,000,000 Hebrews. The bottom of the seabed was sandy, and soon fish and other forms of marine life were flopping around on the sea floor. Among them was a large bottle-nosed dolphin. A number of the Hebrews headed out into the seabed to take advantage of the seafood buffet. Others were hesitant. Caleb and Joshua could not believe their eyes. The sea floor was nearly dry now, and the mile-wide path was open, clear to the other side, some 10 miles away. 1,000-foot watery cliffs flanked either side of that path. "Forward!" Moses called out in a booming voice the whole caravan and the approaching Egyptian armies could hear. Joshua and Caleb took a look back over the caravan from their elevated perch. They could now see armed soldiers advancing nearer on all three sides. They turned to mobilize their militia, and soon everyone was headed out into the mile-wide sea path. The unexpected gift of seafood was gathered up. "Mommy, look, a monster!" little Moses Jr. said, pointing to a huge plesiosaur staring at him from the water cliff. Zipporah let out a shriek. A couple of militia came running up and were also taken aback by the 60-foot sea monster. Little Moses ran over to it. The plesiosaur stuck its head and long neck through the water cliff and took a swipe at the little boy with its huge fanged jaws. Moses Jr. froze, but the creature missed his mark, and the alert militiaman raced over on his steed and whisked little Moses to safety. About 1,000 people refused to go down in the sea path, and soon Pharaoh's cavalry bore down on them. As ordered, all 1,000 were massacred, despite the majority being defecting Egyptians. The procession along the seafloor was moving along in good order until the sounds of the massacre were heard. Panic set in and the pace quickened. Moses opened up the sea at 3:30, and the first Hebrews began reaching the eastern shore 3 hours later at 6:30 p.m. The sun would set in an hour. The panic spread throughout the caravan. The militia worked harder than ever to assist the teeming caravan and also worked to control them from becoming an out-of-control mob. It was difficult, but to their surprise, not an impossible task. Many were injured during the crossing, especially as things accelerated. As the sun crested on the horizon, the last few Hebrew stragglers struggled up the hill that was the eastern shore of the Red Sea, carrying awkward-shaped belongings, pulling balky cattle, and riding camels with minds of their own. Moses was the last to cross, but as he neared the eastern shore, he clambered ahead of the last of the column of stragglers to a rock overhang that overlooked the sea to the west. The pursuit of the Hebrews by Pharaoh's army was held up until Pharaoh himself arrived at the water's edge. He and his generals had a brief conference to decide whether or not to pursue the escaping Hebrews, and if so, how to do it. The sea path lay before them, but that pontoon bridge was only a mile north. They could ride north and cross the bridge and capture their lost slaves. But the bridge was narrow, and it would be a slow crossing. The consensus of the generals was to take the path to the north, but the livid Pharaoh, holding a picture of his dead firstborn son in his hand, would have none of it. He ordered a charge forward of his entire army. He led the charge himself, took the reins from the driver of his two-man chariot, and headed down into the dry seafloor, bounded on either side by 1,000-foot cliffs of water. The army snaked down into the sandy bottom behind him. The first couple of miles of the 10-mile journey were covered in about 10 minutes. Terrified Hebrews, seeing and hearing the approaching army, began to panic further. They began discarding belongings, including animals. Many began to run, and others who could not run were assisted where possible by militia. The resultant debris left by the fleeing Hebrews slowed Pharaoh's army, but they still managed to clear the halfway point, 5 miles, by 7:30 p.m. as the sun was setting. The deepest part of the Red Sea lay about 2 miles off its eastern shore due to the stronger current there. The Hebrew throng from that point began to scramble up the 2 miles of slope some 1,000 feet in elevation above the seafloor. Screams of "We're gonna die" were heard throughout the crowd, but the militia and the strong-hearted pointed up to Moses, now standing high on the eastern shore. He was still clinging to the blue-white little walking stick that Pops had given him. The resolve on his weather-beaten 80-year-old face buoyed everyone's spirits. The farther Pharaoh's boys got into the sea path, the tougher the going got. They were closing the gap fairly rapidly, but their chariot wheels were very narrow and giving them unmatched speed on firm ground. But things now seemed to be getting soggier the deeper the seafloor became. Pharaoh and the lead chariots reached the deepest part of the seafloor, 2 miles from the eastern edge and 1,000 feet down at 7:45 p.m. The sun was on the verge of dropping completely below the horizon, and the cavalry now were forced to take the lead in the chase for the Hebrew column. The tail end of the column now was only 200 yards ahead of them. The cavalry roared by the chariots, miring in the muddy seabed. Pharaoh replaced one of his riders and led the charge up the eastern slope. However, the horses began to lose footing, and Pharaoh ordered an archery division trailing the assault to fire volleys of arrows at the fleeing horde. But to his amazement, the Hebrew column continued its ascent. Further volleys were unsuccessful at slowing that column of Hebrews. Pharaoh's entire army was now slogging up the muddy grade on foot. As the sun eased completely over the horizon, the last of the Hebrews reached the solid ground of the eastern shore of the Red Sea. All now turned to watch the advancing army, but none of them, or any in the advancing army, noticed the figure with the golden eyes standing in the temple doorway on the eastern shore with tears in his eyes and a faint smile on his lips. Pharaoh and the lead Egyptian columns were now scarcely 300 yards from the shore, but still 500 feet below the shoreline. There was a 100-yard wide level area on the shore where the exhausted Hebrew caravan had halted to regroup as they had run out of energy to move further east. Pharaoh now stopped to catch his breath, but noticed the tops of his feet felt wet. He looked down and saw he was now standing in 6 inches of water. He happened to glance back at the gathering twilight, and his skin ran cold. The once dry seafloor was no longer dry. He saw a massive wall of water heading toward the rear of his army. It was advancing rapidly, closing the seafloor behind it. Pharaoh ordered his army to advance at the double quick, but his muddied and exhausted troops could not move any faster. The shrieks of panic from the Hebrews watching from the eastern shore turned to silence of amazement, and then the cheers of Hosanna. Pharaoh and his armies were no match for the power of water, the faith of Moses, nor most certainly the king of the universe. The 1,000-foot-high tsunami ripped into the helpless forces of Pharaoh, and the police so previously foiled by little Moses Jr. got his revenge. He took one swipe at Pharaoh and bit off the king's head. The remainder of the army became delicacies on the buffet table for the Red Sea's native population. Within minutes, the Red Sea was dead calm. The colors that made up the twilight sky were the most spectacular anyone could ever remember. The fire gradually went out in Moses' little wooden walking stick, but did leave a permanent scar on his right palm. Little Moses Jr. fell into a deep sleep as if nothing had happened this first day of April, 1491 BC. Up on Jupiter, the boardroom fell deathly silent, save the intermittent pop of bells slamming his fist into the wall. Up on Saturn, the roars and cheers of hallelujah rocked the old planet on its axis, causing a slight bend in the rings. Pops turned and walked on east toward the Sinai Desert, the little spring in his step speaking volumes about the relief and satisfaction he felt, as at least one of the Hebrew caravan of crazy yet beloved humans still was willing to follow him.